Good evening and greetings and welcome to the Anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences. My name is Uzma Rizvi and I am an Associate Professor of Anthropology and Urban Studies at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. In my role as chair of the board of the Anthropology section, New York Academy of Sciences, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us from all the various places and times you may be from. This evening in New York City, we are excited to present as a part of our 2020-2021 programming on reimagining resilience and our distinguished lecture series, a talk by Professor Fatimah Jackson entitled Evolutionary Perspectives on African North American Genetic Diversity, Origins and Prospects for Future Investigations. This will be followed by discussant comments by Dr. Robin Nelson. We are honored to have both Drs. Jackson and Nelson with us here today. Of course, in order to ensure all of this programming can happen, we rely on grants and sponsors. And so I'd like to acknowledge the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research and Bergen Books for supporting the Anthropology section. Equally significant, if not more consistent, is the Board of Advisors for our section. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the many hours of work done by our board on these events. I particularly wanted to thank board member and vice chair Matt Riley, our treasurer Ryan Rome, and our anthropology section fellows, Anna Sergeva and Miriam Leitner. Without all of them, none of this would have been possible. So for those of you in the audience, you should know we'll be live tweeting during the event, and our handle is at NYAS_anth, A-N-T-H. If you are so inclined, please do join the conversation there. To become part of our growing community, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at NYAS_anth, and you can like us on Facebook, join our listserv, and become part of our vibrant community of anthropologists. Finally, throughout the course of the webinar, you can post questions in the question and answer section on the lower bar of your Zoom menu, or if you're watching us on YouTube, in the comments section. We will be collecting the questions throughout the program and hope we can get to as many of them as possible through the course of the panel. In case of a breach of security, we do have a secondary Zoom ready. It'll take about 10 minutes for a relaunch. We don't anticipate this happening, but if it does, please check your emails for the link. So all those of you who have registered will automatically be sent the secure backup link. I would now like to invite Anthropology Section board member, Dr. Shahrina Chaudhry, who played an instrumental role in envisioning and organizing this program, to introduce our distinguished lecturer for this evening. Shahrina?
Thank you, Uzma. Good evening, everyone. I'm Shahrina Chaudhry. I'm an assistant professor of biological anthropology at Brooklyn College, CUNY, and I'm on the board of advisors at the NYAS Anthropology section. I'm very honored tonight to be introducing Dr. Fatimah Jackson. Dr. Jackson is professor of biology at Howard University. She received her PhD from Cornell University, where her dissertation focused on the relationship of certain genetic traits to the incidence and intensity of malaria in Liberia, West Africa. Since then, she has taught at the University of California at Berkeley, the University of Florida, the University of Maryland in College Park, where she is distinguished scholar, teacher, and professor emerita. She has also taught at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where she directed the Institute for African American Research. She was a visiting scholar at the University of Khartoum in Sudan and a senior Fulbright Fellow in Egypt. Dr. Jackson is also a former director of the W. Montague Cobb Research Laboratory at Howard University and is currently also senior scientist at QuadGrid and also CEO at the Dumont Institute, a multidisciplinary think tank. Much of Dr. Jackson's research has focused on plant-human-animal interactions, as well as health and disease ecology, with one of her goals being to understand how certain plants provide protection against diseases such as malaria. Additionally, as a molecular anthropologist, Dr. Jackson uses the tools of genetics and molecular evidence to retrace patterns of ancestry, especially within people of African descent, and she has been an important voice in challenging race science. Some of her more recent research has focused on population substructuring and uncovering the complex nature of the genetic ancestry of African North American people, This work has exposed some of the limitations of current genomic databases, which hinders a full understanding of such ancestry. In addition, her research on remains from the African burial ground in New York has been critical in informing the development of bioethical guidelines for research on such remains. In addition to her many grants and publications, Dr. Jackson has been honored for her lifetime of accomplishments by several distinguished awards. In 2012, she was the first recipient of the Ernest E. Just Prize in Medical and Public Health Research, awarded by the Avery Research Institute at the College of Charleston and University of South Carolina. In 2017, she was named the STEM Woman Researcher of the Year by Howard University. And most recently, last year, she was awarded the Charles R. Darwin Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, which she will be receiving at the upcoming AAPA conference in a couple of weeks. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Fatimah Jackson. Dr. Jackson.
Thank you so very much. What a very nice introduction. Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury. And thank you, Dr. Rizvi, and thank you to the New York Academy of Sciences Anthropology section for this opportunity to talk about my research. I'm very pleased and very honored to be here. So I suppose I can show my screen now and show the video. Let's see. Just trying to get it up here. Let's see.
Dr. Jackson, would you like us to run the slides?
You know, I may have to because it seems to have disappeared.
Just give us
just like my salary. Yeah, just
just give us 1 second. We'll try to pull them up, and then you'll just have to say next slide.
Okay, I can do that. That's
All
fine.
right.
One less thing to worry about. Great, thank you. Okay, so I am talking about these evolutionary perspectives, and you may wonder, why do we have these why do we need these evolutionary perspectives? So next slide, please. This is our research rationale. You know, when we get, as evolutionary biologists, when we get ready to look at genetic diversity in African Americans, we're really stymied by the absence of comprehensive information on peoples of recent African descent in the Americas. And that extends all the way to the actual genetic information. Now, if you look at this chromosome portrait, here you have your chromosomes here from 1 to the X chromosome, okay? And it's a chromosome, obviously, a profile of a woman, an African-American woman. The red areas indicate her African ancestry. The blue areas indicate her European ancestry. And you can see that there are a lot of gray areas, and those are unassigned or areas on the chromosome for which no data are available. And so really, 64% of her genome is unknown because it's not assigned to any geographical region, or there's no data currently exists on those particular variants. So we only really know the most about her European ancestry, 20% of her genome. Although she's a self-defined African-American woman, we only know about 15% of her African genome. So that's really problematic because we cannot make meaningful genomic inference about this person because her genomic patterns are not in the reference databases. And it's the reference databases that are used to compare with an unknown sample like this that will place this sample in its proper ancestral portrait. Okay, next slide, please. So who are legacy African North Americans? And we've come up with a pretty comprehensive definition, which we think will stand the test of time. African North Americans, so-called legacy African North Americans, are African descended peoples of the Americas, the entirety of the Western Hemisphere. They represent an amalgamation of West, Central, and Southeast African regional and ethnic groups with modest gene flow, that is modest admixture with specific non-Africans. And who are these non-Africans? Well, North Atlantic Europeans, Iberian Europeans, and diverse native Amerindian peoples. Now, these legacy African North Americans have spent about 400 years, approximately 16 generations, of exposure to the adverse environment of the Americas. And throughout the Americas, that has included a history of trauma of kidnapping, of coercion associated with enslavement, torture, institutionalized Jim Crow racism, segregation, discrimination, and all of these environmental features, which have been the dominant themes throughout the 400 years of residence in the Americas, these have uniquely modulated the phenotypes of legacy African North Americans. Next slide, please. So where did these African ancestors of the legacy African American people come from? Well, if you look at the literature, you would think that it was only the coastal regions of West and Central Africa and then Southeast Africa. But actually, our research is looking into the empires and kingdoms that predominated during the period of time of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. And we're finding that people came from very far inland as well and were brought to the coast. So that's what these little lines here represent. These are enslavement regions, but then they were concentrated on the coast so that they could be picked up by the European ships. And this diagram here on the right shows the locations in Africa that were exit locations, and then the arrival points in the various places in the Americas. And what you notice is that the bulk of the African people who were enslaved and brought to the Americas came primarily to South America and to the Caribbean. And really only, still a large number, but only 500,000 Africans were brought to North America. Now that has very important population genetic consequences, because if it's true that less than 500,000 Africans were brought to North America, about 2/3 of those individuals were males, because the number of males exceeded the number of females. And of the females, probably only half actually went on to reproduce. So that leaves us with a grand total of about 70,000 African women who are the mothers of most of the African North American lineages. So that's a really, when you consider that over a 230, 250 year span, that is actually a very small number of founding mothers for what is now 40 million people. So that has caused us to revise a lot of our earlier thoughts on population substructure stratification among African North Americans. But I'll get into that in a moment. Next slide, please. So the research question is, can we apply the basic principles of evolutionary biology to address the historical and contemporary situations of legacy African Americans and get better insights into the origins of this population, selection events, adaptive strategies, survival value, all the things that we as evolutionary biologists and biological anthropologists love to study, but have not done so for legacy African North Americans. So this is a new meaning to Black Lives Matter. Next slide, please. Now, legacy African Americans can be contrasted with the new African immigrants and, of course, Afro-Caribbean immigrants to North America. And it's estimated that the current population of African immigrants is about 2.1 million, okay? So that's 2.1 million compared to the 40 million legacy African North Americans. Now, according to the Migration Policy Institute, at least by 2009, 2/3 of the African immigrants were either from East or West Africa. So these were the major areas where the immigrants were coming from. And these African immigrants carried the epigenomic markers of their home environment, in contrast to legacy African North Americans. So genomically, the two populations are very similar because there's quite a bit of overlap. But in terms of the epigenome, those chemical markers that are acquired from the foods we eat, the things that we're seeing, the experiences that we encounter, those epigenomic markers differ between the immigrant Africans and the legacy African North Americans. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting map because we always think of our country as being a melting pot, and yet even as late as 2019, when you look at the counties and see how people in those counties in the United States self-report their ancestry, it looks like the African descended populations are still pretty much confined to the same counties that provided the bulk of the enslavement, the bulk of the plantations for enslavement back in the last century. So actually 2 centuries back, because this is the 21st century. So we have 3 primary areas here. We have the Chesapeake Bay area, the Carolina Coast area, and then the Mississippi Delta region area. And it's these 3 regions that we've been studying in some detail over the last 20 years, and have developed from them some ideas about the evolutionary background of African North Americans. And from this background, we're able to piece together who these people are, where they came from, and what is the magnitude of genetic variability within the population of current legacy African North Americans. Next slide, please. Now, the reason we need to do this is because there's still a lot of confusion in the literature about even the genetic basis of major health disparities in African Americans. For example, in 2009, Adeyemo and his colleagues at NIH did a very good study looking at genome-wide association for hypertension and blood pressure in African Americans. And they identified these 5 genes, PMS1, SLC24A4, WYHA7, IPO7, and CACANA1H. Now, those were 5 genes, 5 SNPs that were significantly associated with elevated systolic blood pressure. And they also found those SNPs in a sample of West Africans. But then Kidambi comes 3 years later And he says we can't replicate that study by Adeyemo. And he used a geospatially different sample of African Americans, legacy African Americans, and none of the SNPs, the single nucleotide polymorphisms that had been previously evaluated were convincingly associated with hypertension as a binary trait or with blood pressure as a quantitative trait. So this study could not confirm Adeyemo's study. So the question for researchers was, what's going on here? You know, can they both be right when their results are so different? And what we realized, next slide, please, is that clearly African Americans exhibit some level of population substructure, that is stratification. And this stratification continues to befuddle our efforts at a singular classification. So rather than thinking of legacy African Americans as a single population, we may in fact be multiple populations spread out over a broad geographical region. And we've developed this tool called ethnogenetic layering, which is just a computational technique that allows us to deconstruct this substructure and identify the most salient regional, ancestral, genetic, epigenetic, and environmental factors that could account for this high level of within-group variability. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just more on the ethnogenetic layering. And when we couple it with advances in genetic variation detection and analysis, such as genome-wide association studies and bioinformatics, then we may be better equipped to develop a more nuanced understanding of the interrelationships among genetics, the environment, and disease. And one thing to anthropology's credit is that anthropology as a discipline has always been interested in interactions. And now we're seeing that biology is catching up, as it were, with anthropology and focusing on interactions and interactive biology. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just what the ethnogenetic layering looks like. These are the geographical layers, which we hold constant, and then we sample through the horizontal layers. We sample vertically through the horizontal layers in order to characterize a particular geographical locale. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a cartoon, so there'll be several slides that several times you'll need to hit the button. So this ethnogenetic modeling, we collect and digitize the anthropological measures. Then we produce what's called layer, raster and vector maps as a product of the GIS analysis. We associate these with the research interests. Then if you'll hit the cursor one more time, yes, these are the variables that we're looking at. And then we integrate the ethnogenetic and other data and then calculate a metadata analysis for hypothesis testing. Next slide, please. So for this project, we've developed this concept called microethnicity. And by microethnicity, what we mean is the identification in individuals and groups into small and localized self-defined populations. And this is often prior to the emergence of larger macroethnic categories. So for example, before we had that category, Hispanic or Latinx, people refer to themselves as Chicano, you know, or Puerto Rican, you know, or New Rican, or whatever name they called themselves, but it represented a microethnicity rather than the macroethnicity that is used in the census bureaus. Now, the collective identification of structured subgroups is often due to culture, descent, kinship, locality, and politics, and then it's amplified by dietary and subsistence patterns, by ecological setting, by admixture history, by patterns of gene flow, that is who you're mating with and how you're mating with them, and the degree of assimilation into the larger society. Next slide, please. So in terms of migration, African North Americans, legacy African Americans, are a migrating people. You know, we were brought here to the Americas and then migrated with the people that owned us, and then migrated soon thereafter with emancipation to places where we could be more free. And that meant that along the East Coast, the migrations came out of these areas of previous areas of enslavement into places like New York and up into Boston to Philadelphia. From the Middle South, Mississippi, many people went to Chicago. Many people from Louisiana went to Detroit. And then from East Texas and Louisiana, you had huge migrations of legacy African Americans to Oakland and San Francisco and Los Angeles. And it's interesting because along the way, many of these migrants began new Black towns in places like Deerfield, Colorado, or in places in Arizona, and even in New Mexico. We find these small Black towns that were begun by people migrating from the western part of the South. Okay, next slide, please. Now, most of the urbanization among legacy African Americans occurred in the years after 1940, and that was fed by the large influx of Black people to northern cities from the southern rural areas. And this was a huge migration and has been continuous and rapid. And Black Americans have been linked as a result, migrating Black Americans have been linked to major changes in our social structure, our dietary patterns, and also behavioral changes. And these could have potential evolutionary implications and need to be studied. Okay, next slide, please. So we have been focusing on trying to identify an emic perspective. What do the people themselves say about their genetic variation, about their evolutionary history? And we examined about 600 legacy African Americans in the Washington, D.C. area. We found there was ambiguity about Africa, but there was profound interest in Africa. And many of the participants suggested disappointment that there was not more information about them on continental Africa in the reference databases, for example. There was continued reference to significant Amerindian North American ancestry. And this is really interesting because the more legacy African Americans that you ask, the more they emphasize, oh yes, they have Cherokee or Choctaw or Chickasaw or Cree origins. But when you look at the database, the genetic database, it doesn't support that. Well, then I recently published a paper showing that the Amerindian North American ancestry is not even represented in the direct-to-consumer databases. What's represented are Amerindians from Central and South America. So we don't even have the right Amerindian groups with whom African North Americans may have admixed. In this group that I was working with, the 600 individuals that we interviewed and tested, there was minimal interest in their European American ancestry. Although this is beginning to change a little bit with the increased attention to genealogy, because the truth is that in the United States, the best genealogical records are among European Americans. So if you want to get a great insight into your origins and you are not European American, if you have some European American ancestors, you're in much better shape than if you are solely relying upon your previously enslaved African ancestors. And God help us if you're waiting on the Amerindian ancestors, because they don't even appear in many of the genealogical databases. Now, we're not finding any sustained interest in our population in their Neanderthal retentions. And that's very curious to me, because in genetics, we actually know more about Neanderthals than we know about African genomic diversity in contemporary Africans. So, there a lot is known in the literature, but the lack of sustained interest in the legacy North American population is, I feel, a consequence of the association in the popular media, the popular medium of Neanderthals with European heritage. And we know, of course, that Neanderthals are also associated with East Asian heritage, and there are significant retentions in European and Asian descended individuals. Next slide, please. So we've been doing some studies, ongoing studies in South Carolina, and this is just showing you some of the major cities and towns in South Carolina, and then the ecological variation. And there are 3 major ecoregions in South Carolina. And this becomes interesting when we look for the microethnic groups of legacy African North Americans that have been living in South Carolina since the 1700s. Next slide, please. So these are the counties of South Carolina. And then next slide, please. These are the legacy African American microethnic groups. Oh, wait a second. Let's hit it one more time, please. There we go. Okay. So these are the legacy African American microethnic groups in South Carolina. The Gullah Geechee are along the coast here. The brass ankles and buckheads are right next to them in the inland areas. Further up, red legs, and then red bones and sandhillers. And we're going up in elevation as we go toward the northwest corner of this slide. And here on the Piedmont, we see the clay eaters and the bald knobbers. Of course, near the border with North Carolina, you see the Crows, who are also known as Lumbee peoples. So we found about 14 legacy African American microethnic groups just in South Carolina. And these groups extend into Georgia and into North Carolina. And some groups, like the Gullah Geechee, go all the way down to Florida, to Jacksonville, Florida. Next slide, please. These are the Gullah Geechee people, beautiful people who are facing lots of gentrification right now and loss of land, but they are strong in terms of retaining the African aspects of their culture. Next slide, please. And this is one of the queens of the Gullah Geechee, Queen Tet. And the Gullah Geechee practice a way of life that originates from the synthesis of West and West Central African cultures with the nuances of Southern plantation life. And this intermingling, which created something really unique and yet able to be tied back to the sources of origin. So it's a rich diversity of language and food, art and music. And its epicenter is in Beaufort, South Carolina, and the surrounding sea islands. Now, today, the Gullah Geechee thrive, and as I said, they extend beyond South Carolina into Georgia, Florida, and even into Mexico. In fact, there's a group called the Mestis in Mexico that left the Georgia coastal regions and migrated with the Native Americans on the Trail of Tears until they got to Oklahoma. They decided that rather than going into Oklahoma, they'd turn left and go into Texas. And they went down to Texas, all the way down into Brownsville, Texas, crossed over into Mexico with the hope of being free. But these Métis people are very interesting because they speak Spanish. They practice many Mexican cultural patterns, but they make a bread called sweet potato bread. And that sweet potato bread ties them back to their Gullah Geechee origins. And they also have lots of stories about making a long trip and the burdens of that trip and the sacrifices that they made to be a free people. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, this is some of the Gullah Geechee people today trying to recapture some of their African origins. I really love this slide because it shows a real range of African diversity. So here we have in the very center a woman wearing kente cloth, but this man to her right is wearing the warrior costume of the Zulu people. So there's quite a, which is South Africa. So we've got quite a mixture here, but this is an effort to recapture an African past that was not only denigrated, but that was discounted. Next slide, please. Of course, this is a painting, a very famous painting called The Old Plantation. So this is how the Gullah Geechee were dressed in 1790. And this famous painting shows the enslaved Gullah men and women dancing and playing musical instruments derived from Africa. In fact, if you look at these instruments, you can still see these instruments being played in Senegal, Gambia, and elsewhere in West Africa. Next slide, please. So what we think is going on with regard to the Gullah Geechee is that here we have 16th and 18th century Africa. That's an amalgamation of West Central Africa, West Africa, and Southeast African peoples. And the Gullah Geechee are some of the first to pop off, as they say, to emerge from this amalgamation. And then there's admixture subsequent to the formation of the Gullah Geechee with non-Africans. And then that produces these other legacy African North Americans. So we think that the Gullah Geechee peoples may be progenitors of other legacy African North American microethnic groups. Next slide, please. I have just some data to report to you on the Gullah Geechee because, just saying that they are a beginning population or the progenitor population for other legacy African Americans, we have to make that mean something. And so we've begun to look at some of the retentions and health disparities that we see in the Gullah Geechee. So what we see in them is a retention and expansion of African-derived cultural behaviors and ostensibly alleles. Now, it's not true that alleles and culture go hand in hand, but many times when you find certain cultural retentions, you can also find allelic retentions. Now, there's a good match between the existing African cultures that are the origin cultures of the Gullahs and the Geechees and South Carolina low county environments. That ends up promoting cultural retentions because the ecology is more consistent with that which they left in Africa. We also found an increased potential for genetic drift. And because of the isolation of the Gullah Geechee, and until recently, it was seen as a detrimental cultural affiliation. So it is not seen as that now, but that's part of the Black Lives Matter and Afrocentricity movements. But in the past, even 50 years ago, to admit to being Gullah or Geechee was to be subjected to some level of socioeconomic disenfranchisement. Now we find that there are some linguistic retentions among the Gullah Geechee with the Mende peoples of Sierra Leone and from the rice growing regions of Angola and Congo. About 40% of the Gullah Geechee mitochondrial DNA, which is maternally inherited, come from haplogroups that are common in West Central Africa. So this is pretty interesting because even though the people will tell you, yes, we're from Sierra Leone, the fact is that Sierra Leone did not exist at the time of the origin of the Gullah Geechee people. It only came into being much later after the British stopped the transatlantic trade in 1808 and then began importing repatriated Africans back to this place, which came to be known as Sierra Leone and Liberia. So most of the Gullah Geechee genetically seem to come from West Central Africa, and that makes sense because of the rice growing regions in Congo and in Angola, northern Angola. Next slide, please. Now, we also participated in this Project Sugar, which was the Sea Islands Genetic African American Registry Project. And we found among the Gullah Geechee relative ancestral and environmental homogeneity. They pretty much stuck to the lowland coastal regions, and they just expanded either south or north. We found high levels of cardiometabolic risk factors and prominent vascular disease in the Gullah Geechee, especially those who had type 2 diabetes. And the ancestral and genetic background for this is very interesting. We think that the vascular disease may be associated with ancestry in West Central Africa and adaptations in West Central Africa to the tsetse fly. So, you know, this is, again, there are lots of hypotheses here for subsequent testing. And we did find evidence of founder characteristics in the Gullah Geechee. That is, they seem to be marrying within the group, even though they have a rule that among the Gullah Geechee, you cannot marry someone who is within 7 generations of relationship to you. But all that has done is just spread out the Gullah Geechee and make the Gullah Geechee go from Wilmington, North Carolina, all the way down to Jacksonville, Florida. Next slide, please. So in terms of the contemporary Gullah Geechee human biology, at the Avery Research Center for African American History, the South Carolina Racial Disparities Report was compiled, and they documented the patterns of ethnic discrimination, educational disenfranchisement, toxic environmental exposures, persistent gentrification, and significant health disparities among the Gullah Geechee and then among those who live adjacent to the Gullah Geechee. And they found high rates of cardiovascular risk factors. And they think that the similar oppressive environmental conditions seen among the Gullah Geechee are also seen among African North Americans in general. So that makes the Gullah Geechee yet another population that provides insight into African North Americans in general. Next slide, please. So our research questions, where do we want to go? We really want to develop testable hypotheses about the genetic similarities and differences between the various legacy African North American groups. And, you know, we need to develop testable hypotheses about African diversity as well, but it has to be the Africa of 300 to 400 years ago, not necessarily the Africa of today, because Africans have been evolving just as African North Americans have been evolving. We want to develop testable hypotheses about how the epigenome, that is those chemical markers that are in association with genes and can influence gene expression, how do these correlate with the selective effects of enslavement and institutional racism in the social environments of legacy African North Americans? Finally, we want to identify the process of new microethnic group formation and the extinction of old microethnic groups among legacy African North Americans, because new groups are constantly being formed as legacy African Americans move to places like Colorado or to Alaska. New groups form. Sometimes they move as a unit, but then those units are dissolved in the new environment and new groups form. This process of microethnic group formation is really fundamental to the human experience. And so we should expect to see it rather than be surprised by it. Next slide, please. Next slide, yes. So I wanted to say, no, I'm sorry, go back one. Yes, I wanted to say something about COVID because COVID-19 is having such a dramatic impact, particularly on African North Americans. If we had a more robust understanding of the evolutionary biology of this population, we could better provide mitigating solutions that would reduce the increased susceptibility of African North Americans to SARS-CoV-2, which is the causative agent of COVID-19. Unfortunately, human evolutionary biology has been a workhorse in the past for white supremacy and for biocolonialism. And so it is handicapped in the past because it has not fairly looked at peoples of color. And as a result, there remains a paucity of African North American scholars in the field and a dearth of research on the target population in the scientific literature. And that means that we know very little about the people who are closest to us. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to acknowledge with gratitude my co-researchers, the graduate student that worked with me on this project and with whom we'll publish this paper as the first of her dissertation papers is Jennifer Caldwell. She's a doctoral candidate in the Department of Genetics. I also need to thank Dr. Fatimah Jackson, who's a computational biologist and adjunct assistant professor in pediatrics at Howard. And she's also a senior scientist at the National Cancer Institute. And Hassan Jackson, Dr. Hassan Jackson is a geospatial data scientist, and he's a research associate at the Cobb Research Laboratory. He also is the CEO of QuadGrid, which is a startup data science company that he has started and which I wholeheartedly support because we need to apply computational methods, big data to biological anthropology so as to have a better understanding of the future and to predict and optimize that future. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for that very enlightening and informative talk. Look forward to hearing more about it as you and Dr. Nelson discuss it more.
Okay.
So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Robin Nelson, who will be discussing with Dr. Jackson the talk we just heard. Dr. Nelson received her PhD in biological anthropology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in 2008, and her dissertation focused on the evolutionary anthropology of kinship and health in Jamaica. She was previously an assistant professor at the University of California at Riverside and also at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York. And she is currently associate professor of anthropology at Santa Clara University. Dr. Nelson's research has focused on child growth and development, as well as parental investment in contemporary Caribbean populations. She is currently developing a new project exploring experiences of social support, psychosocial stress, adult health, and child growth and development in Black populations in the Greater Toronto Area in Canada. This study is part of a broader research project investigating the long-term effects of migration and social upheaval on kin investment practices and health outcomes among contemporary island and diasporic populations. Additionally, and importantly, Dr. Nelson has been working to promote diversity in the sciences and social sciences. She serves as an advisor for an NSF-funded study titled Evidence-Based Transformation of Undergraduate Field Schools to Promote Safety and Inclusivity Among Southeastern Archaeology. She has also played a leading role in two influential papers focusing on sexual harassment experienced by field researchers, and mitigation strategies to address these issues. One of these was published in PLOS ONE in 2014, and another in American Anthropologist in 2017. Dr. Nelson also participates in various workshops addressing issues of diversity and inclusion, some of which have been funded by the NSF and the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center at Duke University. She has also published commentaries on these topics in journals such as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. With this, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Robin Nelson.
Hello, thank you so much. And I'm just honored, honestly, to be here to speak about Dr. Jackson's work. It's been incredibly influential in anthropology and beyond. And so I hope to be able to provide some context also for the work that she's doing. So I'm just going to try to share my screen here, see how this goes. Okay, can everyone, I'm assuming everyone can see that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Dr. Jackson's work within the broader context of physical anthropology. And I'm thinking about this as On DNA, an American Story, because what she's doing, in fact, is giving us a very in-depth, complicated take on what it means to be a Black American and how we can understand that identity, both biologically and culturally. So some of the questions that we think about as a discipline, as biological anthropologists, one is, how do we come to understand who we are as a species? That's like one of our big kind of organizing concepts. But there's also this more kind of singular question of who gets to decide what we study and what is the proverbial we in this case, right? And how does this shape what we know of ourselves, right? So, so when we start to think about what it means to be a human and what it means to know things within biological anthropology, who gets to make these decisions? Oops, sorry. And so some of the questions that I've been thinking about broadly in my own research, which really got me thinking in light of this particular event this evening, is this idea of the kind of subjective study within anthropology, and specifically what we once always called physical anthropology, we now call biological anthropology. But it's often been kind of humans as a biological construct, but race has also been kind of underpinning many of these conversations broadly. And so we have to start asking questions once we identify the fact that race has always been a question within biological anthropology. It's always been a subject of study. Who has been the investigator and who has been the object of investigation? And so Michel Wolff-Trio discusses this in 2003. He talks about the savage slot of anthropology and how we are always looking at the quote unquote other. And what that means often is quote unquote non-Western people. And we can discuss more broadly how that's been conceptualized in the past. In 2020, Jobson wrote a piece called The Case for Letting Anthropology Burn. And while it was about cultural anthropology specifically, he was talking a bit about some of the intractable problems with how we have constructed what it means to be human and how that has followed us around as a discipline. And so what you see here in this picture from Types of Mankind by Knott and Glidden from 1854 are these classic racial typologies, which kind of undergird much of our understanding of humanity within anthropology. And so there have been some articles which have kind of attacked or questioned this idea of the subject of study and the investigator and the object of investigation within physical anthropology. And what we know is that predominantly when we look at faculty in our discipline, 89% of the faculty doing this research, the kind of research that Dr. Jackson does, are white. We have more interest from different groups, different ethnic groups, folks with different cultural backgrounds early on in undergrad. But as we kind of move up to the point Where Dr. Jackson is, as a senior scholar, where you get to decide the subject of study, we lose that diversity. And in losing that diversity, we also lose people who are capable of asking the kinds of questions that Dr. Jackson is asking and understand the need for increased data collection in particular areas. And so if we think about this field that we're in, it was predominantly dominated by white men until the 1970s. We start to see some women come into the field around that time. We still have an imbalance at full professor. This is really important because when you talk about establishing a research agenda, as Dr. Jackson has, specifically with her work, we have fewer people who can do that with the vision that she has. We have a loss of 4 field departments, and Dr. Jackson can speak about this. We were kind of talking about this informally, but 4 fields in anthropology is biological or physical anthropology, cultural anthropology, linguistics, and archaeology. We lose that kind of dynamic conversation between subdisciplines in anthropology starting in the 80s. And then in the topics of anthropological genetics or genomics, which is specifically what Dr. Jackson works on in part, is that what we saw dominate the conversation for quite a few years here are modern human origins. So where do we come from as modern humans? When did we become quote unquote modern, and what does it mean to be quote unquote modern? So how do we even define modernity is a bit of a debate now. And we see this kind of emphasis on this out of Africa model, which says that modernity kind of emerged about, you might have heard this as like the Eve model, that it emerged about 200,000 years ago or so. And we can trace that back genomically using mtDNA to Africa. And so what you see quite a bit are kind of maps that look something like this. And it's looking at kind of the expansion of people outside of Africa and what modernity looks like. And so in this review paper from 2017, Nielsen and colleagues were tracking how genetic data specifically have come to shape our understanding of the peopling of the world. And then we also see a really kind of interesting emphasis on the peopling of the Americas. And that should actually say the Americas, not the United States specifically, but the Americas more broadly. And so you see a lot of discussion about kind of Bering Strait hypotheses and like when humans kind of came into the Americas and what we can know about the ancestry of Native Americans and indigenous peoples on this land. And so these are the questions that we see cropping up quite a bit in genomics. And when I say cropping up, it's not that the other work isn't being done, but Dr. Jackson laid out very clearly for us where there are holes in the data. And there are reasons that there are holes in those data. And these are the kinds of projects that were getting quite a bit of attention and quite a bit of funding for several years. So when we start looking at the work of Dr. Jackson, we start to see, 30 years plus, 30 plus years of work on everything from co-evolutionary relationships between humans and plants, the African burial ground, questions about mosquito-transmitted diseases, touching on issues around race and identity and models of human origins, dietary questions around genomics. And then we start to see within the last, say, 4 or 5 years, some of the data that she presented today, which has to do with microethnicity, and it has to do with kind of an ethnogenetic ideas about legacy and ancestry, right? And so this is going to seem random, but work with me here. When I read Dr. Jackson's work, I, as a human biologist who was taught in a department that emphasized a lot about behavior, because what I study is in fact behavior, I think of Nico Tinbergen. So Nico Tinbergen is this ethologist, a Dutch ethologist, who was really interested in and left us with these 4 levels of analysis, right? The first level is function or adaptation. The second is evolution or phylogeny. The third is causation or mechanism. And the fourth is development or ontogeny. And so if you're studying human behavior, or animal behavior, the way these show up is if you're looking at number 1, which is adaptation, you're thinking, how does this animal's behavior increase their fitness? Number 2, evolution or phylogeny, you're thinking, how did this behavior evolve? 3, what causes this behavior to continue? What is the mechanistic everyday thing that is causing this behavior to continue? And 4, how has the behavior developed during the lifetime of an individual? These are both evolutionary explanations about behavior and also proximate explanations about behavior. So I'm reading the kind of across time, the work that Dr. Jackson is doing. And I'm thinking, as I was trained as a human behaviorist, we typically can't answer all of these questions at once, right? You pick and choose a couple of these. Like Tim Bergen is telling you, you're going to get at one of these levels, and this is how you can think of it. What Dr. Jackson is doing with her work, and the reason why I wanted to introduce us to Nico Tinbergen in this talk, is she's effectively created levels of analyses through genomics work that in fact tackles evolutionary and proximate explanations while looking at a series of genomic data with ethnographic supportive data as well, and historical data. And so what do we know here? Well, we know that there is a gap in the knowledge, and I think that's something kind of profound to identify here, that with all of the information and discussion recently about genomics and about ancestry and about kind of family legacy, there's actually quite a bit of data that we don't have. Dr. Jackson also speaks to us about African North Americans, and in this way, she is centering American Blackness. What is the American Black experience, both from a kind of deep time perspective and in a kind of relatively recent? So for deep time, for anthropologists, we like to think millions of years, at least 1,000 years, a few hundred years. But we're thinking about centering American Blackness across time, right? Which very few researchers are doing. And that's why we don't have the data already. We're seeing questions that are being asked at the interspace of lived identity and genomic sciences. So what are people doing? If we think about the Gullah Geechee people, for example, what are they doing in terms of cultural practice that we can kind of, that is part of a lived identity? And then how can we think about that with regards to their genomic legacy? Then we have these kind of population genomics and genetics questions that are kind of, what are the biological and social conditions of bottlenecks and founder effects, right? So the bottlenecks that humans went through, particularly Black Americans went through the Middle Passage upon arrival in the United States. And then these different founder effects, as we were talking about earlier, and Dr. Jackson so artfully explained, people moving to different places and getting settled in these new places. Those are almost like mini founder effects, and we don't have the genetic information there. So we are talking about kind of establishing an entire paradigm of study here, like endless research questions. And as a researcher, I can tell you that is fascinating to us. It's sometimes we're not clear on where the holes are, and it's very clear that there are holes here. And so I've been thinking a lot about kind of genomic analyses. And what we know is that there's this academic side of it, which Dr. Jackson is talking to us about tonight. There's also the DTC, or direct to consumer side of this, right? And so if any of you have been gifted a 23andMe kind of gift at Christmas time, you are part of the direct to consumer base of knowledge here, where, and I will say, as a Black woman, there is, and I teach about this every year, it's very interesting and complicated, our relationship to the direct to consumer databases. Because on the one hand, the Middle Passage for many of us represents a sharp cutoff of information about your ancestry, where we don't actually have that information because of the way that chattel slavery was kind of constructed as a means of labor. However, we know that the information we're getting is kind of scattershot. And so while all of this kind of human genomics data and scientific methods were being produced, there was kind of two timelines that were happening. So we have like way back, and this says Watson and Crick, but we know that Franklin was a big part of that discovery of the DNA model back in 1956, and she kind of gets left out. So we have, from the origins of figuring out the structure of the DNA molecule to 2007, which is GWAS and I'm blanking now, genomic-wide, I'm blanking, Dr. Jackson will figure this out. But GWAS is a link. It gives you basically a grand scope of the genome, and it allows you to kind of link genes to diseases. And that's often what people are interested in right now. So we have that kind of human genomics timeline. And also what's happening from an academic side and a kind of ancient DNA side is folks are interested in things like how old the Neanderthals were and how old DNA we can get from Neanderthals, and do we see any admixture, and do we see any kind of ancestry, or when can we date ancestry in the United States to the peopling of the Americas. And so we have these two timelines running basically on top of each other, where you have different applications of genomic knowledge occurring. And as Dr. Jackson explained, Black Americans, and I just know this kind of anecdotally, of course, but kind of maybe less interested in the Neanderthal stuff, and maybe would love to know a little bit more about kind of disease prevalence or ancestry and those questions, right? And so what do we know about this age of genomics? Well, if you've done any of these tests, that they will collect your saliva, they might take a hair sample, you can send some money in. But what we actually know is that for the public, the knowledge that people have about how all this works is kind of low to medium. Like, you kind of got a general idea. That there's something going on, that they can get your DNA out of your saliva, and they're going to tell you something about maybe if you're lactose intolerant or lactase persistent, or if you have kind of sensitivity to caffeine, and maybe something about like ancestry. But as we know, for many of us, there's not a lot of information. And so we see this growing direct consumer model. So there are literally now dozens and dozens of companies. We may always hear about 23andMe, but there are dozens of companies doing this work. But one researcher with reference to this says, when it comes to personal genomic tests, we really have a perfect storm of insufficient data and insufficient competence, right? And so while this is happening in the background, we also have shows like Finding Your Roots, right? Where Skip Gates gives us just a kind of tantalizing view of what we might be able to figure out using actually much of the data that Dr. Jackson was talking about, right? So we're talking about historical documents, we're talking about migration patterns, we're also often talking about genomics as well. And I had this picture of kind of come in late here, because when folks were talking about their ancestry, my mind is so blank today, I'm so sorry. This actor who was in Good Will Hunting and a million other things actually wanted his show pulled because his ancestry was tied to slave owning. So we actually have a lot of conflict here about how we are going to deal with these gaps in the knowledge and what to do with it when we actually find it out. And you might know from this show also that I have this like Bernie Sanders and Larry David here, because Larry David was playing Bernie Sanders on SNL and turns out to be his cousin in real life. So just in goes. And so, lots of interesting information emerging for this, but also sometimes family knowledge that was unknown, like the history of your involvement in chattel slavery. So when we think a little bit about this work, we have to think about the implications of microethnicity. And I love the explanation here of kind of thinking about Latinx, which is, one term to think about, or Latino or Hispanic, a large group of people, but then also Puertorqueña and Mexican American. So Mexican Americans prefer the term Chicano, depending on what your generation and experience and where you grew up, all of these different things. So like, what can microethnicity actually tell us? And why should we focus on that from a genomic standpoint? And I think from a cultural anthropology standpoint, we have often thought that microethnicity is fascinating, right? How do we self-define? How do we find our community? Well, how does that structure what we do, how we think, the practices we engage in? But to think that this might also have genomic implications is actually quite revolutionary. And so in her work, Dr. Jackson has talked to us a bit about health, the potential health implications, that there are still many things that we don't know about the relationship of the genome and particular SNPs to cardiovascular disease risk. Maybe we're finding information about movement and migration. And then also prehistory. What are the deep regional histories that we are missing out on because we're not focusing on things like microethnicity? And I think that it's, to me, I think for anthropologists, and I hope for the public as well, we find Dr. Jackson's work very compelling because these are not questions that are addressed often. Black Americans are often treated like a monolith. And so this idea that microethnicity is important is actually quite an important intervention in the way that this work has been done so far. So looking at things like sweetgrass baskets found amongst the Gullah Geechee people, or the looted Igbo statues, and kind of what we can see about art and practice, thinking about where all of these things show up in the world. And I've been thinking a lot about looted work because we've been talking a lot just as a discipline about museums and ethics, right? And so when we start thinking about kind of where we find these things, what do they tell us about the people who were practicing them? Do we see any implications of those same cultural practices in the United States? Those are kinds of fascinating questions. And so as we identify questions and find a path to the answer, we are talking again to return to kind of a Tinbergian way of thinking about different levels of data collection. Skeletal data gives us information about life experiences and trauma. Ethnographic data gives us all kinds of things about oral histories of communities, cultural practices, foodways, kinship practices, all of that. And then of course, genomic data gives us a ton of information as well. And so this one paper Dr. Jackson has, she talks about creating an entire new framework called a 4C data set, where we are kind of really interrogating ideas of inclusion and exclusion in big data, and how we treat big data and how we think about big data needs to be complicated quite a bit before we assume that everybody has access to this information and everyone is actually receiving accurate analyses about their ancestry via this turn towards a direct-to-consumer model via big data. And then just as an aside, I will say that I have Gullah Geechee people, so I kind of love this part of Dr. Jackson's work. My family has the story of a cousin who came to see my father, and no one could understand what he was saying because he was Gullah Geechee. And my mom said, who's from New York, what is going on with that cousin? And my dad said very matter-of-factly, oh, we're Gullah, you don't know that we're Gullah. And so all of this has kind of resonance in the everyday lives of Black Americans and makes for very salient and kind of crucially overlooked research questions. So I want to thank Dr. Jackson for her insights and for her kind of constant innovation in the fields of genomics and physical anthropology. So thank you everyone for having me.
Wow, thank you so much. What that was really wonderful. I had forgotten about those old papers. Just showing that I really am old. I said, coevolution. Oh my God, that's right. Well, I had some comments on your comments, and I thought it's really important for us to recognize that at the base of precision medicine is ancestry. It's like the trunk and the root of the tree. And then all up in the leaves and everything in the bushy leaves, that's all that fancy dancy stuff like gene interactions, gene environment interactions, pharmacogenomics, blah, blah, blah. We can't get to that unless we don't have the ancestry. The ancestral roots have to be deep in order to have a strong trunk, in order to have the foliage that's up there. That is what people are talking about in the popular literature, but we can't even approach that pharmacogenomics, until we understand the ancestry. So these gaps in knowledge are profound, and they will be an impediment to precision medicine reaching peoples of African descent. Even with all the money in the world, if we're not in the database, we will be like that reference genome that I showed you that was mostly gray. And, and yet that was an African-American woman, a legacy African-American woman. Now, recently we had a family that we tested, and their situation was so profound. They matched through GEDmatch with members of the royal family in Alada, Benin. So two members of the American family actually went to Benin for the Voodoo Festival, and participated in that to the extent that they could understand what was going on. And they were given African names. But the most profound event was that they had a phone call, like a Zoom call, but it was really not Zoom because the French don't have Zoom, something else like Zoom. And the people in Benin, in the Republic of Benin, who were the relatives of this African-American family, looked at each other, and they're waving, and they allowed me to sit in on the call. And they were waving to each other, waving back and forth. And I thought for the moment how 400 years of severance, 400 years of separation was being bridged at that moment, and so the American family had looked on Ancestry and gone back to an ancestor that lived in 1786, and they gave her name. But the question was, who came from Africa? The griot on the African side gave the name of the African that must have been the grandfather of this woman that lived in 1786. It was just so profound because he spoke the name, and just speaking the name calls the ancestors.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. That is profound, Dr. Jackson. I mean, I think one of the points you made earlier that I thought was so important, and it gets collapsed in these conversations, is that if we're going to have an accurate database, or we're going to have appropriate research questions, we also need to make sure that those research questions are tailored to who Africa was, the parts of Africa that we're studying 300 or 400 years ago. That is so important, because in this space where so much information has been lost, purposely so, we want to kind of just collapse these two realities, and they're not, right? Populations have been changing, migrating, everything that's been happening here has been happening there too. And so I think this point about like the way that the oral history kind of informed what to do with the genomics, but because it was time relevant, right? It's several hundred years old, so yeah. You're muted.
The griot in the family gave that name, and he said he left in 1724. Dahomey invaded Alada, imprisoned the royalty, and he who had been head of the family went with his men, with the other warriors, on the ship, and they never knew what happened to him. So they were as curious in Africa about whatever happened to this guy, and did he survive? What happened to him? It just says we are curious about so many things, like what were the conditions of our enslavement in Africa? Why were we sold? What were the conditions of our transport? How did we make a way? And you listen to the old Negro spirituals, and they tell you what the people were concerned about 300 years ago, 350 years ago, 400 years ago. So there's a huge amount of work, research that needs to be done. And we have to create the kind of environment where we can discuss and do these studies unimpeded. Because as I said, evolutionary biology and biological anthropology have been workhorses for white supremacy. Absolutely. They've been part and partial to our oppression as people of color, as oppressed peoples, and they've silenced our voices by ignoring us. And so now we come back as people educated in in evolutionary biology, in biological anthropology, and we say, but what about this underrepresented population? Mm-hmm. Surely they have something to say, and we can know them even better than we can know the population that live thousands of miles away, mm-hmm. you know, who we as anthropologists have been notorious for putting in a time capsule and not allowing to see their progressive growth and development.
Yes, yes. So, and your work resonates so much. I mean, I try not to, do this thing where you're, thinking about yourself constantly, but, I was thinking quite a bit about my own family doing the genomics testing and trying to figure out these histories, because there is a gap in the literature, there is a gap in knowledge. And so we can go back certain generations, we're down in South Carolina, and then we're kind of done. And so, as a biological anthropologist, one thing that I am always kind of questioning, and I wonder how you navigate this in your own research when you're talking to folks in community about what you do and about the kinds of questions you want to answer. How do you kind of talk about what we can know and what we can't know from the genomics? Because, for like my family, they were like, we'll know. Basically, they wanted the story of Benin that you just told. They wanted that for our family.
Yes.
We were queens and, we were Ashanti queens, and like, that's what they want to know. And so, I'm trying to explain to them, this is actually a little bit more complicated, but there's a lot of kind of, there's a need for that connection. And so I'm wondering how you talk about this when you discuss in community.
So I believe that we cannot really and fully heal until we address these questions. And I believe that the technology today will help us if we understand and apply the technology. For example, I'm working with colleagues at QuadGrid. We meet weekly. And one of the things we are doing is trying to redefine the way that we perceive Africa, because the notion that we came from some little village, or we just were walking along the beach and then got snatched, that's probably not true. What we're seeing is that enslavement was organized, and it was organized around kingdoms and empires. And forget about these. You showed my latest, my American Journal of Physical Anthropology paper in January that was talking about so many Nigerians. Why do we all match back to Nigeria? Well, because Nigeria is fake. Nigeria is a fake country.
Yes. And also huge.
It's a colonial construction, but the empires and kingdoms, of which now many overlap into Nigeria and Burkina Faso, Nigeria and Benin, Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire. So those countries, those empires and kingdoms can be studied. So we are trying to develop a database, and then we will develop algorithms to train artificial intelligence so that we can take your family's history. And we know that for the Gullah Geechee people, they probably came into Savannah. So where did they come into Savannah? And or Charleston, or in other words, we're going to try to use artificial intelligence to reconstruct the empires and kingdoms that were active at that particular time, when their people would have come, the slave ships that were in port, and then which ones actually made it to the Americas, so that we can tell more of a comprehensive story, because it's so fundamental to our healing as a people, and to put in proper context why we are here. Because I used to wonder as a child growing up, why are we here? Why are we here? This what happened to the Native Americans, and why are we living on this land? And why do we get brought here? And my family is from Georgia, also my mother's family. So all these stories my grandmother would tell me, and I think, did we do something wrong? I couldn't see us doing anything wrong. So why did we have to go through this? And I've concluded that there's something that we are supposed to learn from this experience. And if we don't explore our experience, we'll never learn it.
And, you know, I mean, my points about the position that you're in, I mean it wholeheartedly because, and we've talked about this a little bit informally, but, you know, coming into physical anthropology as a Black woman, there are so few, for folks in the audience, there are so few Fatimah Jacksons. You should know this. You need to know this. Like,
thank God.
I can but I mean, I can literally count on one hand the scholars at her level who have asked these questions for the length of time and in the kind of dynamic way that she has. And so when someone is in the position to apply for funding to decide the agenda, then these questions start being asked. And we can see parallels with other communities as they are in physical anthropology as well. Like, we have different ways now that we have to deal with Indigenous rights and questions and ethics around data within biological anthropology that 25 years ago people were not doing.
That's right.
Because if you exclude people from the conversation, then they don't get to negotiate the terms of play. And so we see this shifting across the board, and it really does diversify the kinds of research that are being done and actually give us a richer body of work from which to study. And so I just, you know, really grateful for your insights about, and I guess what I would also say is not just insights, it's a lack of fear, if that makes sense. There's a lack of fear in asking questions at different levels.
That's right.
It's much easier to just ask a genomic question and to not ask all the associated historical, prehistorical, and cultural questions.
Right.
And so that kind of just the understanding that we're not going to have a real understanding of these data without those larger, without all of this other information, I think is kind of profound.
I'm notorious for having said at a physical anthropology meeting that genetics without history is just rumor mongering.
Yes.
It's just a he said, she said, you know?
Yes, indeed.
So I'll jump in now. Thank you both so much. That was amazing, and it was wonderful hearing the conversation afterwards between the both of you. We have a lot of questions, it seems, from the audience. So may I start reading them to you both?
Sure.
Okay. Somebody asked, on slide 1, could it be that the gray chromosome areas don't match a clear geographic reference area because they are too admixed? In other words, is it possible they wouldn't match any reference location, even if the entire world were thoroughly referenced?
That's an interesting possibility, but unlikely according to the direct-to-consumer owners of these reference databases. So even if they had small snippets of the gray areas, they should be able to tie them to particular places in Africa. Look, the admixture is only, for this individual, her admixture is only going to be 400 years, transcontinental admixture. Now, within Africa admixture, that may be the more compelling question, you know, because if African Americans are an amalgamation of African peoples, then the greatest proportion of admixture is African admixture. But the African reference database is so poor, that's why we have gray areas. We can't even assign them to Africa, you know?
Dr. Nelson?
I was just going to say, I think sometimes also if you're not, it's hard, we understand Africa is large, but I think, and we understand that the depth of genomic history and diversity lies in Africa, but I think we also have to remember just like how undersampled that is.
Yes.
Right. And so I think that if that were as sampled as other areas in the world, we would not have those gray spaces.
Right. Right.
Thank you. The next question is, how did you arrive at the total number of African women who were brought to North America during the slave trade?
Oh, we looked. That's an easy one. We just looked at the slave manifests and the medical records that existed, and the same way that we came up with the number of Africans brought to North America, then they also specified how many of them were men and how many were women, how many were males, how many were females. The estimate is the more estimated portion of that calculation is how many of those women went on to reproduce. So we just looked at fertility and health and reproductive history under the kinds of conditions that were in place in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, and looking at infant mortality and looking at female infertility, things like that, and looking at the record. It all you just at some point you start estimating. But as far as numbers of enslaved Africans, that was documented because those human beings were considered as property.
The next question is about microethnicity. Does microethnicity perhaps relate to recent communities reported by the consumer testing services? Is it perhaps a more complex and detailed version of that?
I'm not familiar what the consumer services have reported. I'm just simply, let me tell you a quick response to that. I was giving a talk in South Carolina, in Charleston, and I started talking about these microethnicities. And all of a sudden, when I finished my talk, I noticed that my table was surrounded by people standing over me. And they're standing over me, and these are brown-skinned people standing over me, and sitting back in the audience are many dark-complexioned South Carolinians who are looking dejected. And I said, what have I done? Have I reinvigorated some colorism that existed in the past that people worked very hard to get rid of? And sure enough, this degree of assimilation to white culture was a poignant feature of microethnicity. And people said to me, I haven't heard that term since my grandmother said that we were free Moors, or we were Muskegees, or we were, and so I thought, wow, these are terms from 2 and 3 generations back. And the whole negritude movement, the whole Black is Beautiful movement, the whole Black Lives Matter movement has sought to suppress the internal stratification among people of color in general and among Black people in particular, because it's seen as dysfunctional politically, and it is. But in terms of what you had to do to survive 200, 300 years back, it was very much a part of the African-American, the Black American experience. And so, yes, you were Black, but in your community, you were Croat, or you were Lumbee, and you had your own traditions, and you could be distinguished from the people down the road and you didn't marry them, and you didn't eat their food, And to some extent, you can, if you go to the back areas, the rural areas in North Carolina and in Virginia, you can find people who still adhere to microethnicity. So it's not a recent term. It's an old term. The historian Michael Gomez writes about this and talks about how we came to America with a tribal identity, but that tribal identity dissolved over time because it was dysfunctional. To think of myself as Igbo or to think of myself as Yoruba, that didn't really mean anything here, and in fact, it worked against the slave rebellions and the unity of the people, and people became Negro, Black, colored, and then, but the tendency is always to subdivide further, because that's what we do, because We still have Paleolithic brains, all of us.
Dr. Nelson, did you want to add something?
No, I just, I can't help but think about my own kind of experience with this, and it's very true. We have family, and any Black American can tell you that these were methods of survival. This was survival. It was affinity with certain groups and distance from other groups and access to particular resources. But I don't think that the idea that ties to genomics or could tie to genomics or a deeper history has really been considered before this, honestly.
So there's another question relating to microethnicity, which I think has been partially answered, but I'll read it regardless. Has the microethnicity concept been applied to the Afro-Caribbean, diaspora around the world, or are there plans for that? Curious about what natural groupings would emerge.
So I'm going to leave it to Dr. Nelson because she's actually studied people in Jamaica. But I'm absolutely sure that there's microethnicity because I've talked to lots of people from the Caribbean who distinguish which island you're from and which part of which island you're from.
Yes,
so take it away.
I mean, the layers. I mean, this is why I was, and I was trying not to just like lay it on too thick here. But when I was talking about kind of like identifying an entire research paradigm, this is what I mean, right? So if we turn this same lens and we start looking at the Caribbean, we're going to have different questions with the same kind of relevant variables, though, because if we're talking about, say, Trinidad, then we need to be thinking about migration for labor from South Asia. We need to be thinking about Spanish colonialism, British colonialism, and of course, the African slave trade, right? If we're talking about Jamaica, the questions are different again, right? And now we're talking about migration there was a huge migration from Syria, migration from China. We're talking about, of course, Black Caribbean folks moving in. And then, of course, let's not forget the Arawak and Taino people who were in the Caribbean before any of this kind of colonial settler process began. And so there are these different microethnicity questions. People are very aware of who their people are, how long they've been there, and what part of the island even. Like, even if you're taking a small island like Jamaica, which is about the size of Connecticut, and you start splitting it up, people are very clear about where their people are from on the island, how long they've been there. And then if we start getting into questions about, like, say, Maroons and folks that moved away and kind of escaped from chattel slavery, then the questions get even kind of more interesting and complex. And Jada Ben-Torres, who's down at Vanderbilt, has been asking some of these questions. So yes, relevant in the Caribbean, different questions, but literally like a completely different way of taking different kinds of data and applying them to one another.
Right. And Sheila Walker has been looking at Blacks throughout the Americas, and she's found all of these communities in Argentina, in Peru, in Ecuador, places that I didn't even think that there were Black people, but she has been able to track them down and will say they specifically are at this location, and this is how they are organized, this is their stratification, and so forth. So but it's piecemeal. We need to bring it all together in a database so that the database that will benefit our future existence.
Thank you. So the next question is about epigenetics. One of the theories about adverse birth outcomes among Black women is epigenetics in the form of the weathering hypothesis. Others argue it is racism that is epigenetically transmitted. First, what do you think of the weathering hypothesis, Arline Geronimus? And finally, one takeaway from your talk that epigenetics, like many other aspects of biological life, change. If that is the case, then how would we, in fact, use an epigenetic analysis to explore racism in contemporary African-American populations? And thank you again so much for this amazing talk.
Thank you. So we have started looking at epigenetics and epigenomic changes that would be associated with chattel slavery and institutionalized racism. you can imagine it took me a while to get that one published, those papers, but we got them published in the Journal of Clinical Epigenetics. And thank God that the scientific opportunity for scientific publication is broadening. So it's not limited to European Americans and Europeans, but you've got China is playing, India is playing, even Nigeria is involved in the mix. So there are many places that we can publish that are high ranking. And what we found was that, first of all, the epigenetic markers can last for at least 4 generations in mammals. So that means somebody old like me, my great-grandmother's epigenetic experiences, I'm probably still carrying some of those. So, you know, we would expect the retention of some of the legacy of enslavement, Jim Crow discrimination to show up in the genomes of contemporary legacy African Americans. We also would expect, and we would hope, that we'd be able to suggest interventions that would help to ameliorate some of the more negative and deleterious epigenomic markers. And because they are amenable to change, it is possible through dietary and other mechanisms to reverse some of the epigenomic markers. But clearly there has been an inheritance of manifestations. I think, what is it, DeJoy calls it I'm forgetting, but the post-slavery, post-traumatic slave syndrome. And that there really is something to that. And it may be in terms of the epigenome. So the epigenome needs to be studied more thoroughly. We have looked at, for example, telomere length, which is at the end of the chromosomes. And we've compared modern day young adults in Southeast DC, which is an economically disadvantaged region of DC. And we've compared their telomere length with average middle income or upper middle class young adults. And the African American youth in Southeast DC have shorter telomere lengths. That means that they are aging faster. You know, so racism is not without consequence. It is not without consequence, but we have to identify its impact because we're in a quantitative society. We have to identify its impact, and then we have to figure ways to smash it everywhere it pops up. You know, but we can't smash it until we have measures of its impact on our society. And it has a negative impact on all the promoters of racism as well. And it's important to say that in this context of New York Academy of Sciences, that racism inhibits everyone, the ones who receive the racist remarks and the ones who perpetuate them. So studying quantitatively the impact is going to be beneficial for the entire society. And again, we cannot heal until we have a good measure of what's happening to us and why.
Absolutely. The next question, maybe for both of you, how would you recommend integrating these gaps of research into pre-existing topics as a graduate student? Hope that makes sense. Or both as a student and an individual, how can you get involved in this limited area of research?
That's a difficult how question, because there is no roadmap. The best roadmap is the one that Dr. Nelson brought up, that is being creative and being fearless, you know? And you say, what is it that I need to know? Or what needs to be known that I'm qualified to do? And you cannot rely on your predominantly white institution to sanctify what you think you're interested in. Because when I have confronted my predominantly white institutions and said, I want to do such and such history, the biological consequences of racism, they said, well, but we already have someone looking at the colonial past. It's like, excuse me, my problem is not just with the colonial period. I'm taking, it all the way up to the current day. So, and it was at that point that I said I better move to Howard. Now, Howard has some positives and negatives, but my next move is to a think tank where I can just do this 24/7, writing, and because the need is so great. If we don't unite people, we talk about a climate crisis. We've got a biological crisis because we don't know who we are and no one else seems to give a damn. So we have to address this. We have to unite humanity. And we have to set things that were stated wrongly because of racism and sexism and homophobia and Islamophobia. We have to correct that. If we don't correct it, then I have a feeling that we will be embarrassed on the day of judgment, because we have the intelligence, we have the capabilities, we have to put forth the effort. And how do you do it? You just do it. It's like walking. No one teaches you how to walk, but we've come to that time period where all you can do is walk. You can no longer crawl. We must walk. I could be a preacher, huh?
I was just going to say, I don't know if anyone can say anything more after this, because I think that was it. That was so much. That was amazing. This was such an exceptional talk and a brilliant contextualization and discussion. We have so many more questions, but unfortunately the time is limited. So I just wanted to thank everyone for their questions as they're coming in. Clearly, this is a very important topic and something we can continue to engage with. We'll be posting the sort of video on YouTube, and we can continue some of the discussion there. I wanted to thank you both, Dr. Jackson and Dr. Nelson, for this talk, but also in a really real kind of way for making me proud to be an anthropologist, which is a rare feeling. So thank you so much for this. And to all of you viewing this, thank you for joining us for the webinar presentation by the Anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences. Our next event is April 26th, when we'll be joined by Dr. Yolanda Moses. I hope you'll be able to join us for that important talk and discussion as well. Once again, thank you so much to Drs. Jackson, Nelson, and Chaudhry. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And to all those of you who attended this from all across the globe, be well and be safe.